Coffin Bride of Dust Devil Plains, Undead Cheyenne Curse, Cowboy Meets Ghost in 1868. Kansas, the year was 1868, and the vast expanse of the Dust Devil Plains in Kansas seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the blazing sun. The land was unforgiving, its winds howling through the dry grass and scattered weathered rocks. This part of the world was not kind to those who tried to settle it. The heat during the day was unbearable, and the cold of the night could freeze a man to the bone. Few dared to live in these plains, and even fewer were brave enough to travel through it. James Jake Malone, a seasoned cowboy, had heard all the rumors. He'd spent much of his life on the move, working as a trail hand, a cattle driver, and even a rancher when the opportunity presented itself. He'd heard whispers about the Dust Devil Plains, tales told by old-timers at saloons, men who swore that the land was cursed. According to these stories, there were spirits, ghosts of the past, who roamed the plains, seeking revenge on anyone who dared to venture into their domain. One story in particular had stuck with Jake. It was about a woman, a beautiful bride, who had been murdered on her wedding night. Some claimed it had been a betrayal, others said it was a ritual gone wrong. Regardless of the truth, the woman's spirit was said to haunt the plains, never resting, trapped between worlds, seeking vengeance on anyone who crossed her path. They called her the Coffin Bride, and the tale was told in hushed tones as if speaking too loudly might stir her from her eternal slumber. Jake was a man of reason. He'd seen his fair share of odd things during his travels, but he'd never been one to believe in ghosts. To him, the dead were just that, the dead. They didn't walk the earth, especially not in the form of a vengeful bride haunting the plains. There was always a logical explanation for things. That was the way Jake saw the world. He had come to the Dust Devil Plains for a simple reason, a new ranching opportunity. He'd heard from a fellow cowboy that there was good land out here, land that hadn't been claimed yet. It was a chance to build something of his own, a place where he could settle down and perhaps even put his wandering days behind him. He wasn't looking for trouble, nor was he interested in ghost stories. His focus was on the land, on the cattle, and on starting a new chapter of his life. But as he set up camp one evening, something about the plains felt different. The wind, which had been blowing steadily throughout the day, seemed to shift direction, carrying with it an eerie chill. Jake had heard stories of the wind changing on the plains, but this felt different. It wasn't the usual breeze that carried the smell of dust and sagebrush. No, this was colder, almost unnatural. It swept through the camp with a sharp bite, tugging at his coat and making the fire crackle in a way it hadn't before. Jake shrugged off the strange feeling, focusing on his campfire. The flames danced in front of him, casting long shadows across the land. He tried to relax, eating his meager dinner and preparing himself for a night of rest. He knew he had a long journey ahead of him in the morning and he needed to be well rested, but the wind had other plans. As the night wore on, it picked up speed, howling through the trees and rattling the dry, brittle grass. It sounded like whispers, like voices carried by the wind. Jake couldn't make out the words, but the sound unsettled him. It was almost as if the land itself was alive, breathing, watching. By the time the moon had risen high in the sky, Jake's eyes grew heavy. He tried to ignore the strange atmosphere around him, but something in the air felt thick, like the calm before a storm. He lay back on his bedroll, staring up at the stars. It was a clear night, and the sky stretched out above him like an endless ocean of twinkling lights. He had seen many nights like this in his travels, nights where the world seemed at peace and all was right with the world. But tonight, it was different. Jake's thoughts drifted, and he found himself on the edge of sleep when he heard it, a faint rustling sound in the distance. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something moving across the land, something large. The rustling grew closer, and Jake's instincts kicked in. He reached for his rifle, his hand steady despite the unsettling feeling gnawing at him. He had lived through enough dangerous situations to know that when something didn't feel right, it usually wasn't. Then, through the haze of the night, he saw her, a figure in the distance, faint, almost ghostly, her white dress flowing in the wind. At first, Jake thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him, the low light distorting his vision. But as she moved closer, he could see her more clearly. Her pale face framed by dark hair, and her body lithe, almost translucent in the moonlight. She moved with an eerie grace, gliding across the plains as if she were walking on air. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He'd heard the stories, but he had never believed them. The woman was real, and she was coming straight toward him. For a moment, Jake froze. His hand was still gripping the rifle, but he couldn't bring himself to raise it. He had no idea who this woman was, but there was something about her that was unmistakably otherworldly. She didn't seem like a normal person, not in the way she moved, not in the way the wind seemed to follow her. "Who are you?" Jake called out, his voice trembling slightly despite himself. He was a man of action, not a man to be afraid of something so irrational, but this was beyond anything he had ever encountered. The woman stopped a few yards away from him. Her face still pale, turned to him slowly, and her eyes, dark and hollow, met his gaze. Her lips parted and her voice came to him, soft and distant, as if carried on the wind. "Ah, I was once a bride," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "A bride who was meant to be, but never was." He didn't know what to make of her words, but the sadness in her tone was undeniable. There was something tragic about her, something ancient, as if she had been waiting for a long time. "Who did this to you?" Jake asked, stepping closer, his curiosity pushing past his wariness. He could feel her sadness in the air, like a heavy weight that pressed against his chest. "I was cursed," she replied, her voice growing fainter. "My wedding night was meant to be my happiest, but it became my end. I was abandoned by those who should have protected me, and my soul was trapped here, in this cursed place." The stories, they were true. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and he could feel her longing, her pain. "Please," she whispered, "help me find peace. Help me escape this endless torment." As her words echoed in the stillness of the night, Jake stood frozen, torn between disbelief and an overwhelming sense of sympathy. He had never believed in ghosts, never put stock in stories of spirits and curses, but standing here, facing this woman, he could not deny the weight of what she had said. He could feel her sorrow in the very air around him, and it was impossible to ignore. "I'll help you," Jake said, his voice steady now. He didn't know how he could help her, but he couldn't just leave her to wander the plains forever. There had to be something he could do. The woman's form began to fade, her image becoming more and more transparent as the wind picked up again, swirling around them both. "Thank you," she murmured, before her voice was lost in the howling wind. And then, just like that, she was gone. Jake stood there in silence for a long time, staring at the empty plain where the woman had stood. The wind blew fiercely, but it felt different now, less menacing, almost like a soft sigh of relief. Whatever had happened, whatever he had just witnessed, it was only the beginning. Jake had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain. The Dust Devil Plains held secrets, and he was about to uncover them. Jake lay awake long after the strange woman had vanished into the wind. The sounds of the plains had returned to their usual quiet, but the eerie presence still lingered in the air, like a shadow that refused to fade. He couldn't shake the image of her pale face, the hollow eyes, and her voice full of sadness and longing. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze by the time Jake finally closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind raced with thoughts about the ghostly bride and the stories he had heard in town. Could they be true? Was she really the cursed bride of the Cheyenne warrior, doomed to wander these plains forever? Jake didn't know what to believe, but he couldn't ignore what he had seen. As dawn broke over the horizon, Jake packed up his camp and began the long ride across the plains. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. The landscape seemed endless, the flat plains stretching out before him with no sign of life except for the occasional prairie dog or distant bird, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him from behind, waiting for him to turn around. He tried to push the thoughts from his mind. He had a long journey ahead of him, and he needed to focus on the task at hand, but the image of the woman haunted him as he rode. He couldn't ignore her request. She had asked for his help. He had promised to do something, though he wasn't sure what that something was. How could he help a ghost? What was he supposed to do? Jake rode through the plains for hours, the wide open space around him only adding to his growing sense of unease. He stopped for a break at midday and took a swig of water from his canteen. As he rested, he thought about the stories he had heard from other cowboys and travelers, stories of the Cheyenne people, the native tribes that had once roamed these lands, and the rituals they performed. Some claimed the Cheyenne had a connection to the land, their spirits intertwined with the very soil. Others spoke of old, forgotten ceremonies meant to appease the gods, but these rituals had been lost over time. It was then that Jake remembered an old man he had met in a saloon just a few days before arriving at the plains. The man had been a guide for many years, traveling across the land, and he had warned Jake about the cursed plains. He had spoken cryptically about the Cheyenne and the vengeful spirits that could still be felt in certain parts of the territory. He had even mentioned something about a burial ground, a sacred place hidden deep within the plains where the spirits of the dead could never find peace. Jake wondered if this burial ground had something to do with the ghostly woman. Could she be tied to that place? Was that where she had been buried? And if so, could he find it and help her? With renewed determination, Jake decided to seek out the burial ground. He didn't know what he was looking for, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that it held the answers. If he could find this sacred site, maybe he could find a way to help the woman, to set her spirit free. He mounted his horse and set off once again, heading deeper into the plains. As the day wore on, the wind picked up again, carrying with it the scent of dust and sagebrush. Jake could hear the distant howls of coyotes, but the sound seemed far away, as if they were calling from another time. It was a haunting sound, one that sent a shiver down his spine. He had heard coyotes before, but today their cries seemed different, more mournful, as if they too were lost in the vast emptiness of the plains. He pushed forward, his mind focused on the task ahead. The farther he rode, the more isolated he felt. The landscape seemed to grow even more desolate, the land untouched by human hands. There were no signs of other travelers, no towns or settlements in sight. It was as if Jake had stepped into another world, one that existed outside of time, where the past and present blurred together. As night began to fall, Jake set up camp once again, but this time the unease he had felt the day before returned in full force. The wind howled through the night, louder than before, and he could hear the soft rustling of the tall grass, as though something was moving through it. The crackling of his fire was the only sound that broke the silence, but even it seemed distant, as if it were fading into the vast emptiness. Jake had just settled down when he saw it again, the figure in the distance, standing in the moonlight. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as the figure moved closer, he could see that it was her, the woman. She appeared much as she had the night before, her pale face glowing in the moonlight, her white dress flowing behind her like a cloud of mist. Jake's heart raced in his chest. He wasn't sure what to do. He had promised to help her, but how could he? What did she want from him? He had no answers, only the nagging feeling that this was all part of something much larger than he understood. "Please," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "Please help me. I cannot rest. I cannot escape." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had no idea what she wanted from him, but he couldn't ignore the sorrow in her voice, the pleading in her eyes. He knew he had to try to help her, to find a way to put an end to her suffering. "What do you need from me?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the fear that gripped him. "How can I help you?" The woman's eyes seemed to shine with a mix of sadness and hope as she took a step forward. "You must find the place where I was buried," she said softly. "The burial ground. It is hidden, but you must find it. Only then can I be free." Jake nodded, his resolve hardening. He didn't know how he was going to find this burial ground, but he knew that he had to try. The woman's voice had touched something deep inside him, something that told him he couldn't walk away from this. If there was a way to end the curse, he had to find it. The wind howled around him, but the woman's figure began to fade, slowly dissolving into the night. Her last words hung in the air, like a prayer whispered in the wind. "Find the burial ground. Set me free." And then she was gone. Jake sat in silence for a long time, staring at the empty plains, the fire crackling at his feet. The night had grown colder, and the wind seemed to have shifted, as if in response to the woman's plea. He knew what he had to do. The journey ahead would be dangerous, but Jake was determined. The woman's curse needed to be broken, and he was the only one who could do it. The question was, would he be able to find the burial ground in time, or would he too be lost to the cursed winds of Dust Devil Plains? Jake had never been the type of man to believe in superstitions. As a cowboy, he'd spent much of his life out in the wild, battling the elements and facing down dangers that most people could only dream of. He'd been through tough situations, both man-made and natural, but never anything quite like this. The encounter with the ghostly woman had left him rattled, and the promise he made to help her weighed heavily on his mind. He couldn't ignore it. Something inside him told him that he had to see this through. The woman had spoken of a burial ground, a sacred place hidden deep within the plains where her spirit had been trapped. She had asked him to find it and set her free, but Jake didn't know where to start. The vast, desolate plains stretched endlessly before him, and finding something as specific as a hidden burial ground seemed like an impossible task. But he had no choice. The more he thought about her words, the more he realized that this wasn't just a random ghost story. This was something real, something tied to the land itself. Jake had to find answers, and the only way to do that was to speak to someone who might know more about the Cheyenne people, their rituals, and their sacred places. He recalled the old man he had met in a saloon a few days before arriving at the plains. The man had been a guide for many years, traveling across the land and learning about its hidden secrets. Jake decided to seek him out, hoping he could offer some insight into the burial ground the woman had spoken of. It was a long ride to the nearest town, but Jake didn't mind. He had grown used to the solitude of the plains, the wide open spaces that seemed to stretch on forever. The ride gave him time to think, time to process everything that had happened. He couldn't shake the image of the woman's pale face, her mournful eyes, and the sadness in her voice as she had asked for his help. She had been trapped for so long, and now it seemed as though he was the only one who could free her. When Jake finally arrived in the small town, he wasted no time heading to the saloon where he had met the old man. The building was quiet, the door creaking as Jake stepped inside. A few locals were gathered at the bar, chatting and drinking, but the old man was nowhere to be seen. Jake approached the bartender and asked if the guide was around. The bartender gave him a curious look. "You mean old Bill?" he asked. "Haven't seen him in a couple of days. He's been staying out by the river. Said he was looking for something out there." He didn't know why, but something about the mention of the river felt important. It was as if it was tied to the mystery of the burial ground. Without another word, he paid for his drink and set off in the direction of the river. The journey to the river was a quiet one. The land seemed even more barren here, the wind kicking up small clouds of dust as Jake made his way across the plains. He could feel the weight of the land pressing down on him, as if it were alive, watching him, waiting for him to make the wrong move. The feeling of being watched had become stronger with each passing hour, and he couldn't shake the sensation that something was out there, just beyond his sight. When Jake finally reached the river, he saw the old man sitting by the water's edge, staring out across the flowing current. The man's weathered face was lined with years of experience, his eyes a deep, knowing blue that seemed to hold 1,000 untold stories. He didn't look up when Jake approached, but he didn't need to. The old man knew exactly who it was. "I've been waiting for you, son," old Bill said, his voice gravelly but calm. "I knew you'd come looking for answers." Jake didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "I've seen something out there, something that's beyond what I can explain. I need to find a burial ground, something tied to the Cheyenne people, a place that's hidden deep in these plains. I don't know where to start." The old man turned to look at him, his eyes narrowing as if he were weighing Jake's words. "You've seen her, haven't you?" he asked softly. Jake nodded, his heart heavy. "The Coffin bride," the old man continued. "I knew it would be you. You're the one who's supposed to help her." "How do you know about her?" The old man sighed and stood up, brushing the dirt from his pants. "I've been out here a long time, kid. I've seen things, heard stories. The Cheyenne people, they were once part of the land, part of its spirit. But when the white man came, they were driven off. Many of them died, and some of them, they didn't rest easy. Some spirits stayed behind, trapped in the land. The Coffin bride is one of them." Jake listened intently as the old man continued. "She was a bride, once, a young woman promised to a Cheyenne warrior, but something went wrong. The night of her wedding, something happened, and she was killed. Her spirit was cursed, trapped in a place where it couldn't move on. That place is the burial ground." Jake felt a pit form in his stomach. "So what do I do? How do I find this place?" The old man shook his head. "It's not an easy task, son. The burial ground is hidden, and only those who know the land can find it. The Cheyenne, they had a way of keeping their sacred places secret. You'll need to follow the signs, the ones the land gives you. The wind, the stars, the way the land shifts. It will guide you, but you have to be careful. The spirits don't take kindly to strangers." Jake stood in silence for a moment, thinking about the journey ahead. It wasn't going to be easy, but he had made a promise. He couldn't turn back now. "What's the cost?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "The cost?" Old Bill repeated, his eyes hardening. "The cost is your soul, son. You can't just walk in and walk out. If you're going to help that spirit, you have to give something in return. The land demands it." Jake took a deep breath. He knew what the old man meant. The land wasn't just a place. It was alive, with a power that could never be understood by those who didn't respect it. He had come this far, and he couldn't turn back now. If there was a way to break the curse, he was going to find it. Old Bill gave him a long look before speaking again. "The burial ground is close, but it's not easy to find. The wind will guide you, but you'll have to listen carefully. It will take you where you need to go." Jake nodded, his resolve solidifying. "I'll find it," he said. "I'll do whatever it takes." The old man's gaze softened. "I hope you're ready, son. The land will test you, and the spirits won't make it easy. But if you're meant to find the burial ground, the land will show you the way." With that, Jake mounted his horse and set off again, the weight of the journey ahead pressing on him. The wind had begun to stir once more, and the plains stretched out before him like an endless sea of dust and silence. But somewhere in the distance, Jake knew, was the answer he was looking for. He only hoped that the land would guide him and that he could make it out alive. The next few days passed in a blur for Jake as he followed the old man's advice. The wind seemed to guide him, shifting in strange patterns as if it were trying to lead him somewhere. The plains were as vast and empty as ever, but now they felt different, alive in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if the land itself was watching him, waiting for him to find what he had set out for. Jake spent long hours riding through the heat of the day, feeling the burning sun on his back, and then continued late into the cool nights, following the path the wind seemed to lay out for him. It was a strange, almost supernatural sensation, like the land was trying to speak to him, telling him to move this way or that, but never directly. He had no clear map or directions, just the wind and the occasional rustle of the grass beneath his horse's hooves. Each night, Jake set up camp under the stars. The fire flickered in the darkness, casting long, twisted shadows. But it wasn't the night that unsettled him. It was the quiet. There was no sound, no birds, no coyotes, nothing. Just the wind, and sometimes he thought he could hear faint whispers in the distance, carried by the breeze. His mind played tricks on him, or maybe it was the land itself, the restless spirits of the plains reaching out to him. On the 4th day of his search, Jake found something that made his heart skip a beat. At the edge of a shallow creek, he noticed a series of strange markings on the rocks, symbols that looked like they had been carved long ago, worn by time and weather. They were faded, but Jake could still make them out. They were a language he didn't recognize, a language that seemed ancient, as though it had been left by someone who had walked these plains centuries before. He dismounted from his horse and knelt to get a closer look, tracing the symbols with his fingers. As he did, he felt a strange vibration under his fingertips, like a pulse coming from the rocks themselves. It was as if the markings were alive, waiting for him to touch them. He jumped back startled, but the feeling didn't go away. He could sense it now, that strange presence in the air. The spirits of the land were near. They had been watching him all along, and now they were beginning to show themselves that. Jake didn't know what the markings meant, but he knew one thing. This was the place. He could feel it in his bones. The wind shifted again, and this time it didn't feel so gentle. It was colder now, a chill that seemed to seep into his very soul. The land was alive with something dark, something old. The whispers in the wind grew louder, swirling around him, but they were no longer distant. Now, they were right beside him, in his ears, urging him forward. He felt as if the land was pulling him, guiding him towards something hidden just beneath the surface. He knew he had to go deeper into the plains. The burial ground was near, and he was closer than ever. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jake made camp near the creek. He sat by the fire, his mind racing. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. It wasn't the wind or the land this time. This was something else, something personal, as if someone was standing just behind him, waiting. Jake's eyes darted around, but he saw nothing, only the dark empty plain stretching out before him. But the feeling didn't go away. It pressed in on him, suffocating in its intensity. The fire crackled and the wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't the usual sound of the plains. This time, it was different, almost mournful. He stood up, his legs shaky as if the earth beneath him had suddenly become unstable. That's when he saw it again. The woman. She stood at the edge of his camp, her form faint but unmistakable in the moonlight. Her white dress seemed to shimmer like she was made of smoke, her pale face locked in an expression of sorrow. She was closer than before, and this time she didn't speak. She only stared at him, her dark eyes full of emotion that Jake couldn't quite understand. The wind stopped abruptly, leaving a silence that felt deafening. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he took a hesitant step toward her. He had never felt so drawn to something, so compelled to move forward despite the fear gnawing at his insides. The woman's figure began to dissolve into the mist, but before she disappeared entirely, her voice, soft and haunting, reached him again. "Help me," she whispered. "I can't rest until it is done." He had promised her he would help. He couldn't back down now. He couldn't walk away from this, no matter how strange or frightening it was. He had to find the burial ground, and he had to end the curse that bound her spirit to the plains. The next morning, Jake set out again, the feeling of urgency pressing on him. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far. As he rode through the endless grasslands, he searched the landscape for any sign, any hint of what might be hidden beneath the surface. But the plains were vast, and the sun beat down on him with relentless intensity, making it hard to think, hard to focus. By midday, Jake was growing desperate. He stopped near a small cluster of rocks, dismounted, and sat in the shade, wiping the sweat from his brow. It was then that he saw something that made his heart stop. A large stone structure, half buried in the earth, its edges worn smooth by time. The stone looked old, ancient even, and it stood alone in the middle of nowhere, a silent sentinel in the vast emptiness. Jake stood up slowly, his legs heavy with the weight of the moment. He walked toward the stone, each step taking him closer to the answers he sought. As he approached, he noticed markings on the surface of the stone, similar to the ones he had seen earlier by the creek. These were deeper, more defined, as though they had been carved with purpose. The symbols spoke to him, though he couldn't understand their meaning. But they seemed familiar now, as if they were calling to him, telling him that he was in the right place. His breath caught in his throat as he realized what this stone was. This was the burial ground the woman had spoken of. This was the place where her spirit had been trapped, the place where the curse had begun. He knelt down and placed his hand on the stone, feeling the coolness of the rock beneath his fingertips. For a moment nothing happened. The wind remained still, the plain silent. Then a soft breeze picked up, and Jake heard the faintest sound, a whisper, almost too quiet to hear. It was a voice he recognized. The woman's voice. "Help me," she said again. "It's time." Jake stood up, a sense of purpose filling him. He had found it. He had found the burial ground. But now the real work began. He didn't know what he had to do to break the curse, but he would find a way. He had come this far, and there was no turning back. The wind picked up again, stronger this time, swirling around him in a frenzy. The land seemed to come alive with energy, as if it was reacting to his presence. Jake could feel the spirits of the land stirring, moving in the air around him. It was as if the land itself was waiting for him to make the next move. He took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to do whatever it took to break the curse and set the woman's spirit free. Jake stood before the ancient stone, the burial ground, his heart pounding in his chest. The wind had picked up again, swirling around him in gusts that seemed to have a life of their own. The air felt electric, charged with the presence of the spirits that had lingered in the plains for so long. This was the moment, the place where everything would either come to an end or continue in eternal torment. The woman's voice echoed in his mind, soft but persistent, urging him forward. "Help me," she had whispered again, her voice filled with sorrow and desperation. It was the same voice he had heard in the night, the same voice that had guided him across the plains to this very spot. Jake knew this was no longer just about him or his journey. It was about setting things right, about putting an end to the curse that had bound this woman's spirit to the land for so long. He stepped closer to the stone, his fingers brushing against the cool surface. The markings on the stone were clearer now, almost glowing in the dim light of the late afternoon. They seemed to pulse with an energy of their own, as if the stone itself was alive, waiting for something or someone to complete the ritual that had been interrupted all those years ago. Jake had no idea what he was supposed to do. The old man, Old Bill, had warned him of the dangers, but he hadn't given him any clear instructions. All he had said was that the land would guide him. The wind, the symbols, the whispers, everything seemed to be pointing to this moment. Jake could feel it in his gut. This was the place, the time, and he was the one who had to finish what had been started. Taking a deep breath, Jake closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his nerves. He had promised the woman he would help her. He had come too far to turn back now. When he opened his eyes again, the air around him seemed to grow colder, the wind quieter. It was as if everything was holding its breath, waiting for him to act. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a small pouch of herbs that the old man had given him. The old man had told him that the Cheyenne believed certain plants could help open the way between the living and the dead. Jake had no idea if these herbs would actually work, but he had no other options. He poured the contents of the pouch onto the ground in front of the stone, the scent of sage and cedar filling the air. As the herbs settled into the earth, the wind picked up again, swirling around Jake in a powerful gust. The leaves and dust danced in the air, and for a moment Jake thought he saw a figure in the distance, a woman, her pale face illuminated by the fading light. She was standing near the stone, her form faint but unmistakable. The woman. "The Coffin bride. Please," she whispered again, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. "You must set me free." Jake felt a lump form in his throat, the weight of her words pressed down on him. He didn't know if he could do it, if he could truly release her from her torment, but he had to try. He had come this far, and now there was no turning back. "How?" Jake whispered, his voice shaky. "What must I do?" The woman's figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the mist of the evening air, but her voice remained, growing stronger, clearer. You must complete the ceremony, the one that was left unfinished. Only then can I be free. Jake's heart raced. The ceremony. What ceremony? The old man had said something about rituals, but he had never explained what they entailed. Jake didn't know how to perform a ritual, not one that would free a spirit. But as he stood there, he realized that he didn't need to understand everything. He just needed to trust in what the land was telling him, in what the woman had asked of him. He stepped back, his hand resting on the stone. The markings on the surface seemed to glow brighter now, and the wind howled around him as if urging him to act. Without thinking, Jake began to speak, his words coming out in a low, steady voice. He wasn't sure what he was saying, but the words felt right, as if they had always been a part of him. I offer this place to you, he said, his voice strong. I offer my help, I promise. May your spirit find peace. The wind howled louder, the gusts whipping around him in a frenzy. The earth beneath his feet seemed to tremble, and the air grew thick with energy. The markings on the stone began to glow even brighter, their symbols shifting and changing as if they were alive. Jake's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The woman's spirit had been trapped for too long, and this was his chance to set her free. As Jake continued to speak, the earth beneath him seemed to crack open, the ground shifting and rumbling. A deep, rumbling sound echoed through the plains, a sound that seemed to come from the very heart of the earth. For a moment, Jake thought he might be swallowed up by the land itself, but he stood firm, his gaze fixed on the glowing stone. Suddenly, the wind stopped. The earth fell silent. And then from the darkness, the woman appeared before him, her form now fully solid, her eyes glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. Her once sorrowful expression had softened, and for the first time she looked at peace. You have done it, she said, her voice full of gratitude. You have freed me. Thank you. Jake felt a rush of relief wash over him. The air around him seemed to clear, the tension that had gripped the plains for so long lifting. The woman's figure began to fade, her body dissolving into the mist once more. But this time it was different. There was no sadness in her eyes, no longing or sorrow. She was free. I will go now, she whispered, her voice filled with peace. Thank you, brave one. You have given me the rest I sought. Farewell. As her form disappeared into the night, Jake felt a sense of calm wash over him. The land, once filled with tension and darkness, now seemed at peace. The wind had died down, the plains stretching out before him in a serene silence. For the first time since he had arrived, Jake felt a sense of closure, as though the land itself had forgiven him for disturbing its ancient secrets. He stood there for a moment, taking it all in, the quiet, the stillness, and the sense of finality that now hung in the air. The journey had been long, and the cost had been great, but Jake had kept his promise. He had set the spirit free, and in doing so, he had freed himself from the curse of the plains as well. With a final glance at the burial ground, Jake mounted his horse and turned to leave. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow across the landscape. The wind had calmed, and the whispers of the past had faded into the distance. As Jake rode away, he knew that the plains would always be with him, that the land, the spirits, and the story of the Coffin bride would never be forgotten. But now the curse had been lifted, and the land, at long last, was at peace.